The second psalm is a coronation song for the Davidic king. The author of the psalm is David, although that's not identified clearly in the psalm itself. We discern that from Acts chapter 4, verse 25, where David is assigned to be the author. The psalm is classified as a royal psalm by genre, a song of kingship, and the occasion for the psalm is the coronation of the king. In this case, most specifically, Solomon, but later Judaic kings who would follow him. It is also a messianic psalm. By this we mean that it points to one who is greater than Solomon. In the first century AD, there was a great deal of messianic hope for a king like David, like Solomon, who would come and release the Jews from the oppression of the Romans. In this case, this psalm points very clearly in many ways to Jesus, and that's certainly how the New Testament church understood this psalm. From a standpoint of poetry, we see quite a bit of synonymous parallelism in the first six verses. The nations correspond to people, rage corresponding to plot or meditating in vain. The kings of the earth correspond to rulers, set themselves corresponds to take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, and those two correspond with one another. Notice also this second verse is a little longer. It's got an extra line, builds a little bit of intensity, and breaks up the pattern a bit, perhaps to draw attention to it, put the focus there. Verse 3, let us burst their bonds apart, cast away their cords, they say. We see the correspondence there. Verse 4, he who sits corresponds to Lord, and heaven laughs, holds them in derision. He will speak to them in his wrath, terrify them in his fury. Fairly easy to see the synonymous parallelism, the correspondence of each successive line. Then we come to verse 6, and there's a break in the pattern. As for me, I've set my king on Zion, my holy hill. That pattern is broken in this line as if to draw attention and to signify one of the central themes of this psalm. Moving on to the second half of the psalm, I will tell of the decree the Lord said to me. That's synonymous parallelism. You are my son. Today I've begotten you. Those are parallel. Nations corresponds to ends of the earth. Heritage corresponding to possession. Break them, dash them, corresponding, of course, rod of iron, potter's vessel in correspondence. And then verse 10, O kings, be wise, be warned, O rulers of the earth. And here we see actually a chiasm in this correspondence, that they are parallel verses. It's synonymous, but the structure takes us to a chiasm, A, B, B, A, with the main ideas reversed in the second line. Serve the Lord with fear, rejoice with trembling. You see the correspondence there. Final verse 12, kiss the Son, lest he be angry. His wrath is quickly kindled. You can see the correspondence there. This is an example of synthetic parallelism, where something is added in the successive line. And so, like the first six stanzas, you have a similar pattern, synonymous parallelism for 5 verses, and then a different type of parallelism in the final verse of each section. Now, taking a step back to look at the entire structure of the psalm, it's rather interesting because it's clear we have 4 different parts of 3 verses each. We see some correspondence at the beginning and end sections that are referencing what is happening on earth. The kings of the earth, the rulers, and those correspond in verse 10 to the kings and the rulers of the earth there. So we're going to label that the A part. That's stuff that's happening on earth. The B part is the stuff that happens in heaven. And this tends to draw attention to the middle part of this, where the two meet, where heaven and earth come together. As for me, I've set my king on Zion, my holy hill. The Lord declares, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. So the focus there is on the king, who is the embodiment of God on earth as these two come together. Now looking at some of the language in specific words, why do the nations rage, noisily assemble? The alternate translation says, that is, they riot, they rise up. And notice the Hebrew word here in verse 1, the people's plot, and the literal word is hagah, or meditate. They murmur, they complain, they grumble. We remember that word from the first psalm, although it's certainly a different context. And there we have in verse 2, Yahweh, Lord in all caps, the covenant name of God. And then that is corresponding to his anointed. And the That's an English translation of the Hebrew word Messiah, or the Greek word Christ. And then we have a metaphor in verse 3. The peoples view the rule of God as a burden and not a blessing. Psalm 1 would say it's a blessing. The law of the Lord is a blessing. But the opposite reaction to that is to see it as a curse, as a restrictive, and a desire to be freed from the rule of God. In verse 4, we have a good example of an anthropomorphism, where the Lord is laughing in derision. Also in verse 4, we have another name for God, the Lord, lowercase, and this is indicating the Hebrew word Adonai, which is translated Lord or Master. Another key word is in verse 6. I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. That literally means Jerusalem. Jerusalem was also referred to as Zion, but it would take on even greater significance as in a figurative sense, as the place of God's dwelling on earth. Verses 7 and 12 are referring to a son. Yahweh says, "You are my son." He says this to the king, to Solomon, "Today I have fathered you." And then verse 12 enjoins everyone to kiss the son, to respect, honor, reverence this son. The Hebrew word "I have begotten you" is the word that's used in the Old Testament when we talk about the begots. It is yeled, and it simply means fathered. I have fathered you. And it doesn't mean that God literally fathered the king. This is a figurative language. Essentially, Yahweh is saying that in this moment you are acting as my son. You are reflecting me as a father reflects his son. You are my spitting image. You have authority to rule over the earth along with me. I will rule through you. It's essentially what Yahweh is saying here. Verse 8 says to the king, if you would just ask me, I will make the nations your inheritance, the ends of the earth your possessions. This is clearly hyperbole. No ancient kingdom and no modern kingdom has ever ruled the entire earth. The church would be the exception to that, but certainly Solomon here was not going to possess the ends of the earth. So this is an example of hyperbole, exaggeration, to give an idea of the extent of Solomon's kingdom. In addition to that, Solomon would exhibit tremendous power, not just the wealth of the nations in verse 8, but authority over them. You shall break them with a rod of iron. Of course, this is the Iron Age when the psalm was written, so the strongest metal at that point would be significant there to note that he would be absolutely in charge of the nations. And then the final part of verse 9, you will dash them to pieces like a potter's vessel. So obedience and respect to the authority of the king was absolute. Verse 12, kiss the son. We should note that this is not a kiss of affection or romance, but rather a kiss of respect and honor, kissing toward. We ultimately get the Greek word worship, from this idea of kissing toward as a show of respect.